I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Randolph Nesse. He is a emeritus professor in psychiatry and psychology and at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And he's one of the pioneers of evolutionary psychiatry. He's the founding president of the International Society for Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health, and the author of the book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, which we're going to be talking about today. Randy, welcome to the Nature Nurture podcast.
Thanks, Adam. I look forward to talking with you.
Me as well. So I'd never heard of evolutionary psychiatry before. Could we broadly introduce what that is as a field?
Sure. Basically, it applies the principles of evolutionary medicine to psychiatry. And now, of course, you'd like to know what the heck is evolutionary medicine.
Right.
Evolutionary medicine applies the basic principles of evolutionary biology to better understand why organisms are vulnerable to being sick and how we can use that knowledge to better improve prevention and treatment. It has nothing to do with the species per se. It really is just trying to use evolutionary biology the same way we use genetics and physiology and anatomy.
Mm-hmm. Why is it that it seems like we almost have this intuitive dualism? Like when we're talking about the mind or mental illness, we tend to look at more proximal causes and then only look at biology when we're thinking about our bodies.
Yeah, and I think there's a good reason actually for looking at mechanisms of either psychological or more brain kinds, and that is that you want to fix things. And if you want to fix things, you've got to figure out how individuals are different and how they got to be different. We could go back in a minute to nature nurture kind of things. I understand that's a focus of the podcast, but an evolutionary psychiatry approach really takes a whole new question set. It instead of asking why this person gets sick, it asks why are we all vulnerable? Why didn't natural selection do a better job in shaping the brain so that we don't have to suffer so much or have so many other problems from mental disorders?
So it seems like there's sort of this evolutionary bias towards negativity, towards focusing more on the things that can hurt us. And like evolution doesn't care if we're miserable, right? It cares that we are motivated enough.
Isn't that sad? It's so sad. I've just been writing about this for an article I'm working on about evolutionary psychiatry more generally. I mean, there are all these things in the body that are just, they hurt. There's physical pain, there's vomiting, there's nausea, there's cough, there's all those things. And their aversiveness is part of their usefulness. And it's so unfortunate. Wouldn't it be so nice if natural selection could shape pain to say, take your finger out of your flame now, thank you, without having it hurt so much. But that actually wouldn't do the job. And a lot of my work has been applying those principles to emotions. I mean, the largest problems in the world today, many people would say, are negative emotions. We have epidemics of anxiety and depression, and nobody really knows what to do about it. And my theme is that before we try to figure out what to do about it, we should try to figure out why those capacities exist in the first place.
I did a podcast recently with Tal Ben-Shahar on happiness. You might be familiar with some of his work. And we talked about this evolutionary mismatch, that one of the reasons for our current epidemic of unhappiness is that our minds weren't built for the modern environments we're living in.
So mismatch is certainly one of the main themes for evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry. But as an epidemiologist, I'm skeptical to say that we're in the midst of a giant epidemic. Ronald Kessler, probably the world's best epidemiologist for psychiatry, just published an article last month about rates of disorders during COVID. Everybody says, oh, there's this terrible epidemic. He actually did the work and got the data from random samples of households. And the answer is there's only a very mild increase in a very few people. So there's always a tendency, I think, to imagine that what's happening now is an epidemic and all such things. With regards to happiness, one of my very first articles, which has been reprinted many times, is on the evolutionary elusiveness of happiness. Why is it that we all want happiness and we can't get it very easily? And now we come back to where you started, Adam, with whether the whole system is biased towards negativity. Before we go there, though, we should pause for a second and say it is absolutely astounding from an evolutionary viewpoint that some of us could be happy for minutes, hours, even months at a time. It's just, I don't think any other creature necessarily has that. And there's competition through and shot through with all of these relationships and actions we pursue. But somehow or another, we humans have the capacity for warm, loving, stable relationships and meaning. And it's just astounding that we have these capacities, and we should savor them and appreciate them before we go on to try to figure out why so many people are not as fortunate.
So you might say, in evolutionary terms, it's rare to have everything you need, to have food and shelter and social bonds, but that if you did, you'd be happy. And that's
I don't think happiness has much to do with having everything you need or want, because nobody can ever have everything they need or want. I think natural selection has built into us systems for coping with not having what we want. In fact, I make myself unpopular with certain scientific circles, but I think some of psychodynamic defenses are useful, specifically because they keep us from thinking constantly about what we don't have, especially sex. It's there's a built-in mechanism so that we can get on with our lives and not get trapped just pursuing things that we don't have.
Could you give an example of those defense mechanisms and how they're adaptive?
Sure. I mean, there are whole cultures, that devote their religious tenets to concealing sexual cues to prevent people from having, sexual thoughts that will make them feel bad about what they're not having. For all of us, we watch television shows about the rich and famous, and usually they show us the problems those poor people have, making us feel like we really shouldn't feel so bad about not being as rich or famous as they are. And then there's just simply not thinking about things like that and minding our own business and doing our work and walking our dogs and enjoying our meals with friends. It's marvelous that we have been shaped to often enjoy life at long periods without just viciously competing for maximum reproductive success.
Would you say that cultural selection is its own independent force that might work against natural selection in some cases, like in the case of cultural taboos against sex, whereas it seems the evolutionary pressure would be pro-sex all the time?
So the whole business of what's called cultural group selection is profoundly important and too complicated to go into unless we had a whole extra hour. One general principle, though, is that once people get the capacity for morality and guilt and capacities for following social norms, that creates whole new selection forces that further shape us to take advantage of opportunities in cultures that are sophisticated and advanced. And so that's a whole nother, it can lead, of course, to not having sex all the time and having babies. In fact, some religious cults have said that you should never have sex or babies. Guess what happens to them? It's just the way things go. Other religions encourage people to not use birth control and to have as many babies as possible. And those religions tend to do better.
What about other things like viewing gluttony as a sin, for example, whereas again, it seems like the evolutionary pressure might be to eat as much as you can because it's energy, it'll help you survive, at least if you're not in a world where you have an obesity epidemic and the problem runs in the opposite direction.
Well, and that's what most people do, isn't it? They do eat as much as they have accessible to them. In cultures where people walk a lot and their foods are not as calorically rich as the ones in most Western societies, people can sometimes keep their weight under control. But the basic regulation mechanisms for food intake are there in all of us. And understanding those mechanisms is crucial for understanding eating disorders.
So is the idea that if we could simply turn off our negative emotions or turn off feeling pain, we would die out because it would be too easy to flip the switch and we wouldn't be motivated to do the thing that we need to do to fix it?
So when I was in middle school, there was a kid in the class ahead of me who could not experience pain. And none of us messed with him because he didn't care. He would just wail on you and not care. On the other hand, we learned that he had to go home every single night, and his mother had to undress him naked and examine every part of him to see where he'd been injured because he didn't know. Later in medical school, I kept asking about pain and why so many people experience so much pain. And I learned from neurologists that there are certain very rare people, like this fellow in my class ahead of me, who don't experience pain, and they're usually dead by early adulthood. So
Mhm.
it would seem great not to have pain, but it's not good at all.
Huh.
And learning that has had a huge influence on me because that influences things like anxiety. Isaac Marks and I, in a paper we wrote more than 20 years ago, coined the term hypophobia for an anxiety disorder that doesn't come to treatment very often. That's people who just don't have enough anxiety for their own good.
Mhm.
Uh, they don't come for treatment, but boy, they have a potentially fatal disease.
Right. So we're heading sort of into the realm of science fiction, but could it be adaptive if you had almost like a switch that was, let's say, on as a default, but then you could switch it off like you knew you were about to get into a fight? I mean, I guess endorphins sort of do that.
What does that?
Endorphins sort of do that. Like if you
Endorphins.
have an adrenaline rush, then maybe you won't feel pain
It's
for
a
a
good
brief time.
question about, why natural selection shaped the system with endorphins. There are emergency situations when it's wise not to have so much pain so you can lift the car off of your relative or otherwise escape life-threatening danger without being distracted by the fact that you might have lost a foot or something like that. Uh,
Mhm.
that's an overly dramatic and scientifically unjustified way of describing it, but it's very clear that the endorphins exist for regulating the degree to which we experience pain from moment to moment and decreasing the pain vulnerability at times when something else is more important.
Uh-huh. Right, but we can't consciously control it. So it's almost like there's some sort of unconscious observer that decides when to flip that switch.
The mechanisms have evolved over a long, long time, and our conscious apprehension of them, you can't change it using conscious mind that I know of.
So could we talk about different different feelings or emotions that have evolved like on a different time span? You know, you hear about sort of the more ancient lizard brain, and then you hear about more rational cognitive mechanisms that evolved later on. Where do things like anxiety fall on that spectrum?
So actually, Adam, I spent 40 years of my life helping to develop the Anxiety Disorders Clinic at University of Michigan. And it's fun to talk about something I actually know about.
Great.
When I first started seeing patients with anxiety disorders, it was more of a psychodynamic approach, and we tried to figure out what early experiences might have made them especially vulnerable. We very quickly started to recognize that behavior therapy was more effective routinely for more patients. And with that, we continued to ask about earlier experiences that might have led to increased vulnerability, but we were able to treat people very effectively and doing a simple diagnosis and treatment. But I kept wondering, why are so many people so vulnerable to so much anxiety? And asking myself that question over and over and over led me to finally ask, so what's it good for and how is it regulated? Now, anxiety is the emotion, of course, that's most obviously useful. And in a dangerous situation, people with more anxiety do better. And people who don't have enough anxiety have troubles. But that led me to develop what I call the smoke detector principle, which is probably the most important practical application in psychiatry. It really takes what's called signal detection theory from electrical engineering and psychology, which tries to figure out, okay, how much of a cue is necessary for this response to go off?
Mhm.
And if you hear a tiger or if you hear a sound from behind a rock and you don't know if it's a predator, a lion or a tiger, or just a mouse or a monkey, should you run? Well, it depends on a bunch of things. It depends on, whether there are any lions or tigers in the area where you are. It depends on how fast you can run. It depends on whether there's shelter nearby. It depends on how hungry you are and whether or not you need to get water and food for your family. But you put all those things into an equation, and it turns out that false alarms are essential for a normal optimal system. If you
Mhm.
only run when you're sure that there's a predator there, you will become a lion lunch quite quickly. Then
Mhm.
I asked myself, I put in some imaginary numbers into it. And if in fact the cost of a false alarm, that is a panic attack, is say 100 calories, and the cost of not having an attack and being eaten by a lion is 100,000 calories, that's a ratio of 100. You can see where we get to any cue that indicates a risk of greater than 1 in 1,000 means it's worthwhile to run like heck.
Mhm.
Even though 999 times out of 1,000, that means there's not any real danger.
Uh-huh.
And once I realized this, it changed my approach in the clinic with people with panic disorder.
Right. So it seems like there's some sort of fine tuning going on, because on one hand, you want those false alarms to avoid danger, even if it's low risk of danger. On the other hand, you don't want to constantly be afraid by the wind or by anything.
That's right. There are costs to too much anxiety also. This has been studied by behavioral ecologists. If you watch, deer, white-tailed deer grazing, some of them will look up every 15 or 20 seconds to see if there's a predator around, and others will just keep grazing. So
Mhm.
the ones that keep their heads down and don't monitor for predators gain more weight,
Mhm.
but they're at the risk of being caught by a predator. So these are core kinds of trade-offs that shape regulation mechanisms, not just for anxiety, but for every single emotion in there.
Mhm. So are individual differences in anxiety then sort of the result of different levels of anxiety being adaptive in different contexts? Like on average, you have the average level of anxiety, which I guess must be more or less optimal, but then low anxiety could be good in some situations. Higher anxiety could be good in other dangerous situations.
Exactly. And the first principle is, why do all of us have more anxiety than we want or should have? And that's the smoke detector principle. But the second thing you just mentioned, Adam, is quite profound. There are mechanisms that adjust the threshold for anxiety going off to the dangerousness of the situation. I mean, if you've gone to your local watering hole and each of 3 nights something has jumped out and tried to grab you, you will either not go or go with friends or be on alert for running at the least hint
Mhm.
of danger. And that's all a wise thing. The anxiety mechanism is adjusted so the threshold becomes lower, it goes off easier in dangerous situations. And this leads to the actual pathophysiology for a lot of people with anxiety disorders. And they get the idea that somehow those aspects of the panic attack, the sudden pounding in their chest pain, their shortness of breath, muscle tightness, their feeling in their mind like they're going crazy, they get the idea that those indicate a heart attack or a stroke or something terrible. And then every time they experience a little increased heart rate or a little bit of mental confusion, they think, oh my God, it's happening again.
Mhm.
This leads to a positive feedback spiral.
Uh-huh.
So the anxiety causes more anxiety, spiraling up into a full-blown panic attack. I mean, most people with panic disorder are afraid of the fear itself, and understanding and talking to them about, hey, these attacks you're having are actually useful if you're being chased by something that's trying to kill you. And they're just false alarms in that system. That's so helpful for people.
Mhm.
It helps them recognize it's not a stroke, it's not a heart attack, it's a useful response that has false alarms.
Is the fear driven by, like, I get that this is mostly useful, but what if it's that 1 out of 1,000 times where it's not the useful false alarm, but it is in fact this heart attack?
Yeah, you better be out of there as fast as you can. And all of that heart pumping and mental confusion and not thinking about anything except getting out of there is perfectly useful. Yep. Of course, this brings us to post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mhm.
These are people who have experienced very often life-threatening danger, or they watched friends being killed. And in that circumstance, the question arises, I mean, they hear a helicopter from miles away and they think, oh my God, it might be happening again. They dive under a table or they get very, very anxious. And that is not a useful response. They know perfectly well that there's no danger here and now, but the system still goes off. And
Mhm.
here's an unanswered question, and no one really knows how to answer it. Chris Cantor, a researcher in Australia, suggested that post-traumatic stress disorder might in fact be mostly an adaptation. Because if you're at risk of having your life ended, then any cue that indicates that situation is coming back again is worth generating a huge response.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that's right. I think it might also just be that this system is pushed beyond its natural limits and it gets into a nasty positive feedback spiral also.
What is it that causes some people, when exposed to high stress, to develop something like PTSD and others to become sort of this stereotype of like the very hardened, uh, soldier guy who can withstand any stressor?
So that's been the focus of huge studies by Department of Defense and others. Scientist named Naomi Breslau in the Detroit area has done lots of studies on people in Detroit. And sadly, enough bad things happened that she was able to follow people um, before anything happened, and then look at which ones experienced a traumatic event over the next year, and then look at which ones developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And the answer was that the ones who developed more post-traumatic stress disorder had terrible things happen to them in childhood. They were more prone to anxiety and depression than other people in usually. So it's not too surprising, really. There are some mild genetic tendencies towards having more of a vulnerability to PTSD, which go along with more anxiety in general. So not one thing, but a whole lot of things that make some people more vulnerable than others.
So even going back to early childhood traumas, that seems sort of like a similar category of stressors. And some people might respond to that by developing depression or anxiety, and other people might go on to continue this cycle of abuse, like become, there's the stereotype of maybe the bully was themselves bullied, and then instead of becoming depressed, they go on to become a bully.
Yeah, and then there's what's called resilience. Kids who cope with difficulties early in life often cope better later in life, and kids who don't have any experience knowing that they can master challenges are often more vulnerable to things. There's a marvelous series of studies done by a New Zealander named Richard Poulton on early experiences and how they influence phobias. The theory we all had treating phobias early on was that bad early experiences caused your phobia. For instance, fear of heights. And he was able to find a sample of kids who had been to the emergency room, I think between the ages of 2 and 5 or something, because of a fall. And the prediction would be that these kids would be more likely to have height fears later in life. And he was marvelously, because of this fabulous database they have in New Zealand, to look and see whether they had height phobias later in life. And to everyone's surprise, they had fewer height phobias than other people. So how do we explain this? The evolutionary explanation is very straightforward. They didn't have enough sense early in life to avoid climbing on things and falling off, and they still don't have much anxiety, while other kids did have more anxiety early that protected them from those kind of falls. There's one other thing relevant to this that you mentioned that comes to mind, which is that kids very often do things that are dangerous over and over again. My kids, when they were little, would fall off the end of the couch when they crawled over it, bang their heads and cry, and then they'd go do it again. And I would say, don't do that again, and they'd laugh and go do it again. This is a natural built-in system for mastering challenges. And I think you find that very often. It's why some people, I think, are never really relaxed unless they're hanging on the edge of a mountain that they've climbed in the middle of winter. And there's people who push themselves to do things that are very frightening and master that fear.
Are these systems, on one hand, you have anxiety inhibiting novel exploration, let's say, and then on the other hand, you have a motivation for exploration. Are those two sides to the same coin, or are they separate systems?
So let's go into that a little bit more. You can, if you study mice, for instance, one of the main ways they study anxiety in mice is by giving them what's called an open field test. And the idea is you give a mouse a drug and you see whether it explores an open field or whether it hides in the corners. And this is a pretty good way to look for new drugs that might cause or relieve anxiety. And of course, as you're suggesting, Adam, the mice that always hang out in the corners don't get much food. And the ones that, but they do prevent themselves from getting killed. Exactly the same general principle that we've been talking about for panic attacks in humans.
So fear could be learned or it could be innate, right? Because there's the idea of having a phobia, which is almost like a general class of, let's just say, people who have phobias versus having phobias to one thing but not another. What determines, I guess there's two questions there. What determines developing a phobia, and what determines what that would be attached to?
So I've just reviewed the literature on who gets simple phobias like spiders and things like that. And it's surprising that we still don't really know. It looks like the reigning theory now is that there is simply a predisposition to have those phobias that's built into some people, moderately heritable. And it's not much from early experiences. Most of my snake phobics that I treated had either never seen a snake, and none of them had ever been harmed by a snake. So that's about phobias in general. Isaac Marks and I had a wonderful time working together, writing an article, Fear and Fitness, which really was one of the very first ones to try to map evolutionary principles and show how they could be useful in understanding anxiety disorders. And one of the resources he pointed me to is research by Susan Meinicke at Northwestern University. And she was interested in prepared learning. Fascinating studies, which kind of show that we really shouldn't be talking about nature or nurture at all. Because naturalists, I mean, here's the experiment she did. That's the best way of introducing it. She took monkeys that had never seen a snake, and she had them reach over a little tray to get a banana. Then she put a flower in the tray and they reached right over it to get their banana. Then she put a snake in the tray, a little rubber snake, and they reached right over it, not fearing the snake at all. So there was no innate fear of the snake. Then she showed them videos of other monkeys expressing fear towards a flower or fear towards a snake. Fascinatingly, these little monkeys continued to reach right over the flower, even though they'd seen other monkeys being frightened by a flower. But if they'd seen other monkeys express a fear of a snake, they were afraid of snakes indefinitely. This works apparently for deer as well. A fawn, it will not likely fear a wolf just on first sight. But if it sees its mother fear a wolf, it instantly gets a lifelong fear. So this is called prepared learning. It looks like natural selection is not shaped mechanisms that just go off from some cue all by itself. It shapes mechanisms for special kinds of learning that are prepared and ready to go to certain kinds of cues. Arnie Ullman in Florida has done wonderful studies looking at subliminal presentation of these kinds of cues. And he's found that even people who aren't really aware of what's going on have a little bit of increased skin conductance and high heart rate when they have a subliminal exposure to a spider image as compared with a flower image. So natural selection is not so simple as making things innate or learned.
So why is that the learning wouldn't transfer over in the case of the flower? It's like, my parent is scared of this. Shouldn't I be scared of this as well?
It's because there's something about that image of the snake that is wired in to be connected to anxiety, especially easily, while there's no such ready-made pathway between anxiety and the flower.
So that could turn into a very complicated series of questions of how memory works in the brain, and neither of us are experts there, so probably shouldn't go down that rabbit hole.
Right, but this is all important for if you're going to treat anxiety disorders patients in the clinic, or if you have an anxiety disorder. It's just so important to realize why anxiety is there, how it's normally regulated, how it gets out of regulation, how positive feedback cycles create most anxiety problems, and how exposure therapy works. The old idea was that you had to do counter conditioning and have people be very, very calm while holding a snake in order to decrease the phobic fear that they had before. It turned out that that's not necessary. It turns out that if a person who has a snake phobia can hold the snake even though they're terrified, their fear will go away very nicely and quite promptly, just because that's how the system is designed. Be good if the snake didn't bite them, of course. But this and that is not undoing the previous fear learning. It is adding new downward going inhibitory pathways in the brain that create new mechanisms stimulating calm instead of anxiety. And the best evidence for that is Pavlov's dogs. I'm sure know about Pavlov's dogs being taught, withdrawal responses to electric shocks from a buzzer and that kind of thing. But he conditioned them, and he wanted to treat them, so he deconditioned them by repeated exposure to the buzzer without anything bad happening. But then there was a terrible flood in Moscow, and many of the dogs had to swim and almost drowned. The amazing thing, after that, many of them got their phobias back again. We were just talking a minute ago about how the whole system adjusts to the dangerousness of the situation. And in this case, it looked pretty clear that the increased threat that these dogs experience in general wiped out the new learning of downward going inhibitory mechanisms that decrease anxiety.
So the threat, even if it's a general threat or an unrelated threat like water, will re-trigger a specific fear, like fear of the electric shock?
More needs to be done on that, and I'm not sure to the extent to which it generalizes to everything, but certainly in that case, it dramatically illustrates that life-threatening trauma or a threat to the dog can re-arouse previously extinguished fear responses.
Mm-hmm. So this seems, again, related to this idea of whether phobias are general or specific. Like, let's say there's a set of characteristics or exposures that predispose someone to developing a phobia. And let's say it's a phobia of something they've never encountered in real life, like you have a snake phobia, but you've never seen a snake. Why do some people who've never seen a snake develop a fear of snakes, and maybe other people who have developed a fear of spiders have never seen a spider? What maps on to snake versus spider? What determines that?
So the best answer to that one, Adam, is there are little minor differences between their brains. And in some cases, it has to do with experiences and even symbolic experiences. I vividly remember the woman we were treating for her snake phobia who suddenly said, "Oh my God, I just remembered when it started." I said, "Well, wow, well, keep holding the snake, but tell us." And she said, "I was driving with my father on a dirt road and he stopped and we chopped up a snake with a shovel, put it in a mason jar and said, 'Here, hold this between your legs.'" And I was about a 10-year-old girl. And I think that's when it started. My psychoanalytic supervisors were fascinated by that particular anecdote. But every once in a while you hear something like that. But for the vast majority of cases, you never find out where a specific phobia came from. But going back also, what about all these different kinds of anxiety we have? And that comes to more of a thought about how emotions get the way they are in general. The people with snake phobias don't necessarily have spider phobias also. In fact, very few would. And how about fear of heights? People with fear of heights don't generally have a fear of closed-in spaces. All of these are different situations that could be dangerous. There's some tendency for people who are anxious to be more anxious about other things. And there's some people who are afraid of everything. Those are the people with what's called generalized anxiety disorder, who are just constantly anticipating terrible things that could happen. But for most people who have a phobia, it's a one specific thing and unconnected with other kinds of phobia.
So I've heard in some popular psychology lectures by Jordan Peterson, maybe you could speak to whether this is true or not, that when people overcome a fear of anxiety, it's not the anxiety or the fear going away, but that it's rather developing something like courage, so that the fear is still there, but you just override it rather than learning to get rid of it.
I certainly concur with the idea that some of the bravest people in the world are those with anxiety disorders, because people who don't have an anxiety don't have to be courageous. They can just go do stuff. But I'm not sure we should view the curing of a phobia as generating courage. It more as simply, creating new downward going mechanisms that take away the fear if the person does the exercises long enough and consistently enough.
So that's the question, whether it's taking away the fear or whether it's learning to ignore it. Like
it really takes away the fear. You have to screw up your courage and do something. This is why anxiety disorder treatment is so hard, actually. If it was easy, people would do it for themselves. But you have to help someone realize that the way to get over the fear is to do something that feels grossly unnatural, about doing something that feels very, very dangerous and makes you feel awful. But if you can convince somebody to do that, they will reliably get better.
Are you familiar with Abigail Marsh's work?
No, I'm not.
She's a neuroscientist who studies empathy and altruism, extraordinary acts of altruism, like donating your kidney to a stranger, or people who run into a burning building to save someone, things like that. And one of the things in the case of a heroic rescuer, she was saying, she asked them, "Were you scared?" and was expecting to find that these are, that minority of people that are extraordinarily low in anxiety. And she found, they said, "No, I was scared out of my mind, but like this sense of urgency for the other person overrided that."
Yeah. The motivation to help can override motivations to save your own life in certain circumstances. Absolutely.
So from an evolutionary perspective, you mentioned earlier it's a mystery why some people can be happy for prolonged periods of time. Have you studied more positive emotions in addition to negative emotions from an evolutionary perspective?
So actually, the person who really got a lot of positive emotions research started was Barbara Fredrickson, who is my colleague at University of Michigan. And so I've been deeply familiar with the positive emotions research initiatives, and I support them. I mean, it's really about time that we study positive emotions. On the other hand, there's a big tendency for many people in that field to act like positive emotions are unalloyed good things in all circumstances. And from my point of view, different emotions are valuable or useless or dangerous depending on the situation. I mean, in a good situation, happiness, positive mood, relaxation, and calm are all good things, and people who experience negative emotions are at a really big disadvantage. And understanding not just neutral emotions, but positive emotions like flow and the like are very wonderful. On the other hand, experiencing flow and a lot of positive emotions when you're in a very bad, dangerous situation is not good for you. And so there are four categories, I would say, of emotional problems. One is too much bad feeling when there's no reason for it. And the other is too little bad feeling when there is a need for it. Another is too much good feeling when it's not justified. And the other is not enough good feeling when it is justified. So the principle I would put out there is that whether feelings are useful or not depends entirely on the situation. Natural selection has generally created mechanisms that adjust our emotions to the situation. On the other hand, with this tendency towards a negative bias, because there are a lot of dangerous situations out there.
That's a great 2x2 table. So it sounds like we've spent most of this conversation so far talking about too much anxiety when there's no need for it. Perhaps we could go through the other three, maybe starting with not enough anxiety when you should have more.
So this is hypophobia, and guess what? It has not been the topic of hardly anybody's study, because who's going to come to a clinic saying, I don't have enough anxiety, could you please help me? On the other hand, there's one group of individuals in all societies that's more vulnerable than others. You can guess who that is. I mean, it's men. If you look in the Grand Canyon records about who falls off the Grand Canyon cliffs and dies, it's men 2-to-1. If you look at who gets in auto accidents, it's men 3-to-1. Men are prone to do wild and crazy things because almost certainly of sexual competition and showing off and that kind of thing. And it would be here's an interesting angle on this. Women have twice as much anxiety and anxiety disorders as men. It's not a matter of them coming to clinics more. If you go door to door and you ask people, do you have an anxiety disorder, in great standardized ways, women have twice as many anxiety disorders as men, and it's not just the USA, it's cross-cultural. So then you have to say, well, why is that? What's wrong with these women? How can we help them to be more like men? But from an evolutionary point of view, that's the wrong approach. Now, the right approach is to ask, so exactly how much anxiety is optimal? The women's amount of anxiety is generally about optimal. Men do not have enough anxiety for their own good. The system is skewed to maximize their reproduction at the cost of their own health.
That's very interesting. Why do you think that we don't tend to talk about the downsides of not enough anxiety?
Who wants anxiety? Not me, not you. I mean, it's painful, and just, I mean, this is a general principle, not just in psychiatry, but across medicine. I mean, all of these defensive responses are painful and aversive for really good reason, and that makes them seem like diseases themselves. Pain very often seems like the problem, although once you think about it, pain is actually a useful response to a problem. More so, vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, cough, they seem like the problems. But of course, those are not the problems. Those are useful responses to problems, which, just like panic disorder, are prone to the smoke detector principle. They're prone to go off when they're not needed because they're relatively, I mean, vomiting is really awful, except not vomiting might result in you dying if there's a bad toxin in there. And so it's very safe generally for doctors to help patients. You find medications that block perfectly normal protective responses. That works, 99 times out of 100. But the other time, you really shouldn't mess with the normal system. Doctors know this about cough, and everybody should. An ordinary cough that's clearing out bad stuff from your lungs is a valuable response. People who don't have enough cough, either because they're taking opiates or because of some other kind of reason, they're really vulnerable to getting pneumonia and dying. After surgery, the surgeon will say, you've got a cough, blow into this bottle, make sure you cough. And that's to clear out the foreign material in the lungs to prevent pneumonia. If you blindly and stupidly just go giving people codeine or some other cough suppressant, you're going to kill some people by interfering with the normal response.
Uh-huh. So then in the case of something like depression, it sounds like it's not just a matter of mitigating the symptoms, but a matter of finding out how much depression you should have given your life situation, and then only adjusting if it's more than you should have, perhaps.
But depression doesn't seem very useful, does it?
Well, I suppose it depends how good or bad your life is.
So how can depression possibly be useful, though? I mean, say you're unemployed and your spouse has left you and you're in bad circumstances. Does lying there in your bed feeling like you're a useless lump of something and that it's all hopeless help you? No, the best response in that circumstance is to say, you know what? It seems like it's bad, but I can find a job. I can find somebody. I mean, it's paradoxical, isn't it? It doesn't make really obvious sense that depression should ever be useful.
So you need to have this unique sort of motivated positive emotion, but not just positive emotion in the sense that you feel good enough that you don't need to get off your couch.
Yeah. So we should go back to how emotions evolved in the first place, Adam. I've just been reviewing, there's a book coming out next year with 67 chapters about evolution and emotions.
Wow.
It's going to be really wonderful. And wow, I mean, most of those chapters talk about how emotions give advantages. And many of them talk about emotions having functions. The function of anger is, the function of jealousy is. And I've argued for a long time and not convinced everybody quite yet that that's the wrong way to go about it. Because although every emotion has functions, describing them that way is kind of like pretending that they're parts of a machine that somebody designed. I think a better way of looking at it is to ask, how did these emotions come to be in the first place? And the answer to that is, hey, if this individual expresses certain kinds of responses physiologically and cognitively and facial expression wise in that particular circumstance, that gave a selective advantage. And natural selection has gradually shaped whole suites of responses that are useful in the face of life-threatening danger, in the face of someone who's very attractive you might want to date, in the face of someone who's threatening you and challenging your status. There are all these different situations that have shaped emotions. And each emotion from this point of view corresponds to some situation that's recurred over evolutionary time. And now, if you want to, we can finally go back to depression.
Right. So both of those explanations make complete sense to me. I don't see how they're at odds with one another.
They're not completely at odds, but many people who, I mean, you end up making long lists of how something can be useful. The function of anger is to attack an animal, or to indicate that you can't be messed with, or to end a relationship, or to, and it gets very quickly to be these long lists of ways in which anger can be useful. I think a larger scale way of looking at this is anger is useful in situations where you have been betrayed by someone. But it's also useful in other situations. This comes back to what I call tacit creationism. That's looking at the mind as if it is designed and has components that make sense and are connected in simple ways, and they have simple boundaries. And I don't think that's right. I think natural selection has shaped a very messy system in there with parts that don't have sharp boundaries or simple connections. And as a result, our attempts to label the emotions and say what each one is for are destined to eternal, controversy. Instead, if we talk about, there are a lot of overlapping situations that give rise to overlapping suites of responses and control systems that are intermingled with each other, making it all very hard. But we can still see that there are some situations in which I'll call it low mood, mild depression might be useful.
Would you say that emotions can most fundamentally be boiled down to positive or negative, or approach versus avoidance, and that the granularity comes with context.
Yeah, a lot of other previous emotions theories have talked about emotions as arrayed on a two-axis graph, one dimension being valence, so positive or negative. And there's an easy explanation for that, isn't there? If a situation doesn't pose threats or opportunities, there's no need for an emotion because it's not going to influence your fitness. So it's a very easy reason why emotions mostly are positive or negative. Something like surprise is not necessarily positive or negative, but it indicates something is up that deserves your attention. The other dimension that people usually talk about for emotions is from arousal to calm. And that too is one of the main dimensions of all organisms. They exert more energy sometimes and less at other times. The sympathetic system gears everything up for activity, and the parasympathetic system goes off when it's time to calm down and let systems repair themselves.
I like that theory. So Randy, back to this 2x2 that we laid out, going on the positive side now. What about excess positive emotion when there shouldn't be that much?
There are people who invest in the stock market. And they imagine that their recent gains will get them more gains, or who gamble and one time for the slot machine going off makes them quite confident they are lucky and they're positive and they're going to do well and the like. I think there is a general bias shaped by natural selection for people to have an overly optimistic view of their own abilities in life. This has actually been shown many times in psychological experiments. But it can overshoot. If it overshoots big time, we call it mania and manic depressive illness. But there are other people who are what you call hypomanic, or just kind of happy all the time, or at least positive all the time. And they do not disengage much. I once gave a lecture for a group at Cambridge. There was actually a positive psychology group, one of their first ones, and I gave my 20-minute talk about how negative emotions could be useful. And the leader of the group turned to the group and said, "Oh, have any of you experienced any time when negative emotions have been useful?" So these are a group of positive psychologists. And they all looked at each other and they looked at me and I looked at the floor and we waited for a little bit. And it was kind of a dreadful situation because they clearly were not buying what I was saying. And then one woman says, "You know what? If I hadn't been such a positive person, I would have left that schmuck 15 years sooner instead of sticking with him all that time." And everybody laughed, but it's not that funny because I think there are people who, don't have the kinds of negative feelings that get you out of a bad situation at the right time.
Right. So the evolutionary analog for that type of excess positive emotion, I suppose, could be thinking you can hunt down like a giant mammoth on your own and look how much meat I'm going to get, and then you get stampeded.
That's a nice analogy. That indeed, yeah. Or imagine my ancestors on a small island in Norway in middle of February who were optimistic. And they decided, "I'm going to go out and find some berries." There aren't any berries. Any of my ancestors who did that died, which is probably why my ancestors were not all that optimistic people, because being too optimistic in the middle of Norway in the middle of winter is a death sentence.
So then, to bring us to this last piece of the quadrant, probably the most obvious one, not having enough positive motivation when you should have more. Like, I guess again, if it's time to go hunt for berries and you think there are none and you're being a pessimist about it, maybe you starve.
Yeah, and that can be induced, of course, by bad experience. If in fact the last 4 times you went out, you didn't find any berries, you might not know that there's berries out there because you don't bother to go looking. Bergstrom and Meacham are friends and colleagues of mine who've done a project expanding some of my ideas about depression, and they have a mathematical model of an organism hiding in a hole, wondering if it should come out and go foraging, or if it should just stay in its hole. And in this model, the organism goes out several times and each time encounters a fox. And after a while, even though there's food out there and it's safe, it never figures out that it's safe because it is shaped to not go out and test the waters. This is how I think a lot of psychotherapy works, actually. It's helping people go test the waters and become more optimistic, more realistic about what's out there. Tim Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy is based on this principle that people have unjustifiably negative feelings about themselves and the world and their life. And They do. A lot of depression is unrealistic negative feelings, but there may be good evolutionary explanations for why.
Mhm. Randy, is there anything else in your research that we haven't had the chance to talk about that you'd like to mention?
Well, since we've talked about low mood, we haven't really gotten to the situation in which it's useful.
Mhm.
It's not loss. Loss creates sadness. And I
Mhm.
think one of the more profound implications of evolutionary psychiatry is to get more detailed and ask, so is it loss that causes depression or low mood? I think most often it's actually pursuing an unreachable goal, because natural selection has shaped mechanisms to disengage useless efforts. Otherwise, you just keep doing the same useless thing forever. Um, in modern societies, this is especially hard because we're all induced by social media and our parents and our educate institutions to strive for greatness,
Mhm.
and we all fail. And it's just a matter of what we realize when we fail and what we do instead, and the like. Some people just keep persisting and persisting and persisting.
Mhm.
And 1 out of 1,000 of them is going to become a Nobel Prize winner or something.
Mhm.
But the other 999 are going to be pretty miserable for a long time while they're failing. It's
Mhm.
so tricky to figure out when it's the right time to give up on something. You don't want to give up too fast. You're in the middle of an education program and you just failed 2 exams. Do you just quit? You shouldn't really. It might have been a bad day. You really should, but you should pause and see if you can find a different way to your goal. Or your marriage isn't good for this month. You just bag it. Not smart. Much better to wait and see if there's something else that can be done.
Uh-huh.
In those circumstances, it's really good to not just jump to the quickest new thing. It's good not to be too optimistic. And I think this may conceivably explain some of the unjustified pessimism in some depression,
Mhm.
because stopping an individual or any organism from jumping too fast to the next patch or the next partner or the next opportunity allows them to reestablish something that they had before that's useful, and it stabilizes life, and it's a better strategy overall. On the other hand, the damn strategy overshoots so often, and so many people are plagued by depression. And before we go one step further and before we end, and a whole lot of depression and anxiety really is a product of brain problems and genetic problems. And this whole idea that we should argue about whether they're mainly learned or maybe genetic or mainly, it's different for different people.
Mhm.
And I think there's no substitute for trying to understand every individual as an individual.
Uh-huh. So I suppose the optimistic view is that it doesn't matter how exactly you got your symptoms as long as there are interventions that can work to put a more positive on it.
Although I would say it's really much better to try to figure out whether your symptoms are coming from the fact that your mother and your grandfather and your sister all have the same genes that cause depression, or whether really you're much more unhappy with your job than you actually are aware of. And there are things you could do to make your life better if you were willing to take the risks and the energy to make a big change.
Mhm. So when you were talking about this bias that people have to sort of overestimate their own abilities, does that relate to this idea of internal versus external locus of control? Is there an evolutionary bias towards a greater internal locus of control?
That's an interesting idea, Adam, that I haven't really thought about. I'd love to hear more of your ideas about that one. What do you think?
I think so. I'm imagining that whether you're right or not, it's going to be more motivating to believe that you're fundamentally in control of your thoughts, emotions, and actions. And
Yeah. So Michael Ruse, the famous evolutionary philosopher, had one little paragraph in one of his books that really struck me. And he said, if we didn't have free will, we'd have to believe in it anyway, because otherwise you couldn't hold anybody else responsible for what they do,
right.
including holding yourself responsible for what you do. And I think we have to believe that we can control ourselves and our future in order to have any hope of managing things. On the other hand, drug abuse is a product of people believing in free will a lot. People
Mhm.
say, oh, other people might get addicted, but I'm not going to. I can just stop if I want to. Yeah, good luck, buddy.
Right.
It's very hard to convince kids that they cannot actually control themselves nearly to the extent that they imagine that they could.
Mhm.
And
Right.
we all decide to lose weight by just dieting, right? I'm just going
Right.
to stop eating for a few days. And then what happens? You end up gorging and gaining weight.
So I normally like to end on an optimistic note. This is an interesting conversation because on one hand, there's an optimistic take that many of these bad emotions in our lives are for a good purpose. On the other hand, there's a bit of caution about the full optimism that you might like to have about how controlled we are.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that evolutionary psychiatry, which is coming into its own just in the next few years, offers huge opportunities for us. That's what my book is about, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, is how understanding where these negative feelings came from can help us to treat them better right now. I mean, you talk with your patients differently and you think about them yourselves differently. If you take an evolutionary view, instead of just saying, I'm depressed, I'm a defective person, I got to go to a doctor and get a drug that'll fix my brain, you pause and you say, wait, is there something I'm trying to do in life that just isn't working, but I can't give up? So the low mood just escalates and escalates. And you can have that conversation with yourself or better with a therapist. And this can be life-changing. And it also changes from people blaming themselves and the stigma to making us all organisms in the world who are doing things, and we have some control over our lives, but we also have to accept that our emotions are just going to bubble up in these situations, whether we like it or not.
Randy, thank you very much for your time. It's been
Thanks,
great.
Adam. I've enjoyed talking with you, and good luck with the rest of the podcast.
Thank you.